They laughed when the lawyer skipped my name at the will reading. But when he opened the final envelope and read who inherited everything, their smiles vanished, and so did their strength. Before we begin, imagine spending your whole life being treated like a ghost in your own family. Now imagine the day comes when your silence speaks louder than their names ever could. This is the story of how quiet loyalty shattered a legacy built on pride. Kindly subscribe to our channel to support us. Let's begin. I arrived exactly 5 minutes early. Not out of excitement, far from it. I wanted to sit, settle, and watch them walk in one by one like the royalty they thought they were. The receptionist barely glanced at me as I gave my name. "They're in conference room C," she said without looking up, her tone just polite enough to be called professional. I nodded, adjusted the collar of my coat, and walked down the carpeted hallway. My shoes made no sound on the floor, and that somehow felt symbolic. I had learned to be invisible in this family. Even today, the day of my grandfather's will reading, I knew my presence was barely tolerated. I didn't expect hugs or even handshakes. I expected cold eyes and cooler silences, just like always. The door was already slightly ajar when I reached it. I could hear them. My father's low, assertive voice, probably discussing terms with the lawyer like he was still in charge. My mother's shrill, controlling tone, complaining about the delay or the air conditioning. My sister's laugh, fake and delicate, the kind she'd perfected after years of social climbing. I took a breath, pushed the door open slowly, and stepped inside. Their laughter died down almost immediately. Eyes turned. The air shifted. My mother blinked, gave me a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes, and scooted her chair half an inch closer to my father. My father, Richard, didn't even try to pretend. He scowled and muttered something under his breath. My sister, Ava, rolled her eyes in slow motion and turned her body away from me like I was a bad smell she was trying to escape. There were 10 chairs around the table. 9 were already taken. I walked around quietly and sat at the only empty seat, at the farthest end of the table. They didn't need to say a word to let me know I didn't belong. Their body language said it all. It was the same chair I'd sat in during Grandpa's last birthday dinner, the one they'd made awkward by whispering about me the entire night. It was the same chair I was always given, whether we were at a dinner table, a boardroom, or a family photo session. Slightly cut off, half-shadowed, out of place. Back then, it used to sting. Now, it was just routine. Familiar, even. I didn't come here hoping for some great inheritance. I wasn't like them, circling like vultures, already dreaming about new cars, vacation homes, and control of Whitmore Enterprises. No, I came because Grandpa deserved that. Because for all the silence I endured from my parents, he gave me years of conversation. While they were off living lives they couldn't even let me witness, Grandpa taught me how to live mine. He taught me about kindness, about dignity, about standing quietly when you're being pushed, but never folding. He used to say, sometimes, "Mason, the strongest tree is the one that bends in silence during storms." And I had bent. For years. Without breaking. Mr. Carlyle, the family's longtime attorney, walked in just as the clock struck 10. He looked exactly as I remembered, balding, slightly hunched, always clutching that worn leather folder like it held the cure to every problem. He gave a small nod of greeting to the room. When his eyes landed on me, he paused. Just for a second. Then nodded again. Slightly deeper. He remembered. I helped Grandpa through the final paperwork. I brought the meals. I drove him to the notary's office. Carlyle knew that, but he didn't say anything. He just opened the folder and began. Before he could read a single word, my father cut in. "Let's get this over with. I assume things will proceed as expected." Mr. Carlyle looked at him with mild amusement, as if he'd heard that line too many times from too many greedy families. "The will shall speak for itself," he said. That shut my father up for now. My fingers remained folded in my lap. I didn't dare show emotion, didn't give them the satisfaction of watching me squirm or hope. I could feel Ava's eyes dart toward me from time to time, mocking, calculating. She had always been the favorite. My parents made sure of that. Top schools, expensive gifts, front row seats to affection and validation. Meanwhile, I got silence for Christmas. Blares for birthdays. We're doing this for your own good, for everything else. I could have screamed, could have fought, but I learned early that even when you shouted in this family, they only heard what they wanted. The air inside that room was thick with tension and fake perfume. My mother tapped her diamond-ringed fingers on the table, eyes narrowed like she already had plans for Grandpa's beach house. My father sat upright, trying to look like the man of the hour, but the slight tremor in his hand betrayed him. Ava pulled out her phone, probably texting her influencer boyfriend about which property she wanted the most. They were all so sure. And I just watched. I watched them like someone watching the last minutes of a movie they'd seen 100 times, predictable, rehearsed, tiring. But this time, the ending wouldn't be what they expected. The first name Mr. Carlyle read out wasn't mine. Of course, it wasn't. To my granddaughter Ava Whitmore, he began, I leave my vintage jewelry collection, currently secured in the family vault, in the summer home in Cape Cod, including all furnishings and art therein. The moment those words landed, Ava let out a sound that was half gasp, half squeal. Her hand flew to her chest, as if she'd won some national award, and my mother reached over to give her hand a squeeze of approval. I watched the entire exchange unfold with a quiet stillness, knowing full well they had likely gone through every corner of Grandpa's Cape Cod home in their minds already, picturing beach parties, property listings, and tasteful Instagram shots of inherited wealth. My father nodded proudly, a self-satisfied smirk spreading across his face, as if his legacy had just been secured through her. He leaned over to my mother and whispered, That's exactly what we expected, loud enough for me to hear. And I did hear it. Every syllable. Not because it was new, it wasn't, but because it was always meant as a reminder. I wasn't one of them. I was the mistake. The weak link. The kid who dropped out of business school and chose carpentry over corporate, sweat over stocks. I was supposed to fade into the wallpaper during these kinds of events. Just show up and keep my mouth shut. That was the expectation. Mr. Carlyle didn't pause. He moved on with deliberate calm, like a man who had seen too many greedy hands fighting over the dead. To my son Richard and his wife Gloria, he continued, I leave the BMW 7 Series, my collection of rare wines, and the totality of stocks currently held under Whitmore Enterprises, amounting to approximately $2.1 million. That was when my father actually leaned back and laughed, not a big laugh, just a small, smug chuckle of confirmation. Like this was always the natural order of things. Like he'd earned it through decades of neglect and distance dressed up as discipline. My mother dabbed the corner of her eye like it was a touching tribute. In truth, they both looked relieved, as if the reading of the will had validated their identity all over again. My father, the rightful heir. My mother, the honored matriarch. Ava, the prized jewel. And me? Still no mention. I could almost see Ava glance over at me and suppress a smirk. That quick, subtle movement. So practiced, so precise. She wasn't gloating outright. That would be too obvious. She just wanted me to know my name hadn't been called yet, and probably wouldn't be. It stung more than I wanted to admit. I had prepared myself for it, mentally and emotionally. I told myself walking into that room not to expect anything, that this would be just another chapter in the long book of being ignored. But when you grow up craving scraps of acknowledgement, even silence feels like a slap. I clenched my jaw and forced my shoulders to relax, refusing to give them any reaction. But inside, I was beginning to feel it. That pressure, that ache, that familiar weight of being told you're less without a single word spoken to your face. My fingers tapped gently on the table. Once, then twice, then I stopped. I didn't want to seem impatient. Mr. Carlyle shuffled his papers again, lips pursed in focus. The following, he said slowly, represents the remainder of Mr. Whitmore's assets, including property rights, executive control, and undistributed wealth held in offshore trusts. There was a subtle shift in the room. Ava straightened. My father uncrossed his legs and leaned in, a greedy anticipation building just behind his stern face. This was the big one. Everyone knew it. The real prize, the full control of Whitmore Enterprises, the family estate, and the legacy Grandpa built from scratch with his own calloused hands. That's when Ava spoke, loud enough to fill the silence that followed. "That should go to me," she said flatly, like it was fact, like it wasn't even worth discussing. My mother murmured in agreement, almost like a reflex. "Of course, darling. It's your birthright." My father remained quiet, but he didn't disagree. In his eyes, too, there was no debate. Ava had been groomed for the family name since she was 12, prepped with private tutors, escorted to fundraisers, presented like a crown jewel in every annual gala. Me? I was the one who got a toolbox for Christmas and silence at Thanksgiving. I turned my gaze to the window beside me, the city skyline gleaming in the distance. Somewhere in one of those towers, people were working hard to become someone. I wondered how many of them came from families that never saw them for who they were. How many were told, directly or indirectly, that they were less. I didn't want pity. I didn't need their scraps. But I had loved Grandpa. Truly. He had seen the good in me when no one else even looked. He told me once, "I built this family name with my hands. The one who gets it next better know how to hold something other than a wine glass." That memory warmed me even as the cold words in the room tried to freeze me out. They thought they knew how the story would end. They had already written the conclusion before Carlyle had finished reading the script. Ava was already halfway into planning how to announce her promotion to CEO on LinkedIn. My father was probably picturing himself strolling through the estate gardens with his scotch, proud that the empire remained with his people. But the story had a twist, one none of them saw coming. A final move that would change everything. And it was only a sentence away. There was a beat of silence. A space too long to be comfortable, too short to be mistaken for a pause. Mr. Carlyle's eyes moved slowly across the sheet in front of him, lips forming each word silently before saying them aloud. Then, finally, the moment broke. His voice, calm and unmistakably deliberate, echoed through the room. And finally, to my grandson, Mason Whitmore, the air thickened in a heartbeat. My name had been spoken, not whispered, not skipped, not ignored. Said clearly, plainly, undeniably. My name. The one they always left off invitations and out of introductions. For the first time in years, I was no longer the missing line in the family narrative. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. My father stiffened beside my mother, who dropped her handkerchief. Ava turned toward Mr. Carlyle with eyes wide in confusion. "Mason?" she asked, as though it were a misprint. He meant to say Martin or Marcus or Mason, Mr. Carlyle repeated, this time looking straight at me. His tone didn't waver. "Charles Whitmore's grandson. The one who took care of him during his final 3 years. The one who lived with him, drove him to his appointments, cooked his meals, and managed his medications." That silence. They couldn't swallow it fast enough. Ava's jaw clenched. My mother's lips pursed so tightly they nearly disappeared. My father leaned forward slowly, his voice gravelly with disbelief. "That can't be right," he muttered. "Mason isn't even on the board. He doesn't have any equity. He's not involved in the company." His words came out disjointed, almost like he was talking to himself, grappling to reassemble a reality that had suddenly cracked at the center. Mr. Carlyle didn't dignify the protest. He simply cleared his throat and continued. "To Mason Whitmore, my grandson and companion in my final years, I leave the remainder of my estate. This includes all properties not previously assigned, liquid and offshore assets, and a controlling 52% share of Whitmore Enterprises. Additionally, he is granted executive power to restructure the family trust, pending board approval, which I have preemptively recommended." His voice was steady, firm, and final. There was no ambiguity, no loophole, no last-minute switch waiting in the wings. It was done. Ava's voice rose suddenly, shrill and disbelieving. "This is insane," she cried. "He's not even part of this family. Not really. He dropped out of school. He works with his hands, for God's sake. Grandpa must have been confused. He was old and sick. He didn't know what he was signing. She looked around for support, expecting my parents to chime in. My mother opened her mouth, but for once, no words came. My father's hands were flat on the table, knuckles white, fingers trembling as he gripped the surface like he might fall through it. Carlyle calmly reached into his folder and pulled out a sealed envelope, thicker than the rest, labeled with a gold-stamped crest. "This," he said, placing it in front of me, "contains the original signed amendments to Mr. Whitmore's will, notarized and witnessed. It also contains letters he wrote to each of you. You may choose to read them in private, or not at all. I didn't reach for it. Not yet. I let it sit there, a quiet bomb, while they stared at it like it was radioactive. That envelope didn't just hold money, it held answers. Truth. Legacy. And the irreversible decision of a man they had underestimated far too long. My father finally spoke again, his voice lower now, bitter. You manipulated him. He was vulnerable, and you took advantage of that. You poisoned his thoughts against us. His words, sharp and cutting, filled with accusation, but behind them was fear. Not of me, but of what it meant to lose everything to someone they had written off. You're not one of us, he added, quieter this time. You never were. I looked at him then. Looked directly at him for the first time in that room. And I didn't flinch. You're right, I said slowly. I wasn't one of you. I didn't lie to him. I didn't disappear when he got sick. I didn't wait until the reading of a will to show interest in who he was. I wasn't one of you. I was there. My mother choked on her breath and reached for her water. Ava stood so abruptly her chair tipped backward and crashed to the floor. This is theft, she spat. You don't deserve a cent of it. I picked up the envelope then. Finally, it was heavier than it looked, thick with papers and signatures and consequences. I held it in both hands and stood. Grandpa thought otherwise, I said. My voice wasn't raised. I wasn't shouting. I wasn't gloating. I was just done. Their world had just collapsed, and I wasn't going to stay in the rubble with them. The envelope was still warm in my hands. It wasn't just paper, it was the weight of years unspoken. The weight of every moment I was overlooked. Every birthday they forgot. Every family dinner they accidentally excluded me from. Every comment disguised as advice that made me feel like I'd never measure up. That envelope didn't just contain wealth, it contained justice. And that justice was unfolding in real time, right in front of me. For once, I wasn't the one shrinking into my chair. I wasn't the one being talked over or ignored. I was the one they were now turning toward, with disbelief, panic, and a desperation they couldn't hide anymore. My father stood, slow and stiff, as if his legs were made of lead. He had built his whole life on control, controlling the company, the narrative, and the family image. But at that moment, he had none. His eyes locked on the document in my hands like it had betrayed him, like it had been meant for him, but somehow slipped away. There has to be a mistake, he muttered, though his voice was breaking. He wouldn't just hand everything over to you. You're a child. You're not capable of enough, Mr. Carlyle said, interrupting for the first time with something close to command. It startled everyone. Charles Whitmore made his intentions clear over months, not days. I advised him to consider alternatives. He declined. Repeatedly. I've served this family for over 20 years, and I assure you, this is no mistake. Your father chose Mason with full clarity and intention. You would do well to honor that. My father's mouth opened and closed again like a man gasping for air underwater. And then he sat a heart, like his knees gave out. My mother let out a small cry and reached for him, but even she looked uncertain now, her eyes darting toward me like I'd suddenly become a stranger holding a loaded weapon. Ava, for all her noise earlier, was now silent. Her arms were crossed, her fingers trembling, her eyes red, not from tears, but from rage she couldn't name out loud. She had never been told no in her life, not like this. Not publicly, not where it counted. That's when it happened. My mother slumped forward in her seat, her shoulders collapsing, her breath catching in a way that made the room freeze. Her hand flew to her chest as her head tilted slightly, eyes wide with disbelief. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, but unmistakable. She fainted. The room burst in emotion. Carlyle calling for assistance, Ava screaming, my father frozen in place. A security guard outside the conference room ran in, and within moments, someone was dialing 911. I stood back, unmoving, as chaos exploded around me. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel triumph. I felt peace, and it was unsettling how calm that peace was. They weren't collapsing because of a death. They were collapsing because the illusion had died. The carefully built story they told themselves, that loyalty, wealth, and love were theirs by default, was over. Grandpa had rewritten the story. He turned the final page and handed me the pen. And they were watching a life they thought belonged to them crumble in real time, unable to stop it. The paramedics arrived in minutes. They checked my mother's vitals and carried her out on a stretcher. She was conscious but limp, her eyes avoiding mine, as if I were a bad dream she hoped to wake from. Ava followed close behind, trying to keep her composure while muttering threats that no one took seriously. We'll appeal this. We'll sue. You won't get away with this. I didn't respond, not because I didn't have words, but because she didn't deserve them. When the room finally emptied, just Mr. Carlyle and me, I sat down again, slowly, and opened the envelope. Inside were multiple sealed documents, all properly notarized. There were titles, account details, instructions, and a single handwritten letter from Grandpa. Just one page, folded carefully. I opened it and read silently. Mason, if you're reading this, it means you showed up. Again, just like you always did. You never asked for anything, but I leave you everything. Because love without action is just noise, and you were the only one who ever acted like family. Build something beautiful. Quietly. Grandpa, I folded it back, pressed it to my chest for a second, then tucked it away. Not because I needed to prove anything to them, but because his words mattered. His words were the only ones that ever really did. The silence in that conference room now felt different. Not heavy, cleansing, like the storm had passed, like truth had finally been allowed to speak. And as I stood to leave, envelope in hand, I realized I didn't just inherit assets. I inherited the power to walk forward without needing anyone's approval. And that, more than anything, was the collapse they never saw coming. The echo of their voices had finally died down. The chairs were crooked now, some pushed away in panic, some left abandoned in a hurry. Only two people remained in the room. Mr. Carlyle, still sorting papers into his leather folder with methodical calm, and me, standing at the head of the table with the envelope clutched against my chest like it was part of me. The dust was settling, but the air still carried the weight of everything that had been shattered. Not glass or furniture, but illusions. Theirs had been broken in broad daylight, and for once, I wasn't the casualty. I turned toward Carlyle. He looked up, gave a slight nod, and said, "You don't owe them anything." His voice was measured, but there was something deeper behind it, something that felt like closure. I nodded once, not because I needed permission, but because I finally understood something. I had the floor now. The same room that once treated my voice like background noise was quiet, listening. Even in absence, their judgment still lingered, but so did the silence they could no longer fill. It was mine to speak into now. So, I did. I walked slowly to the center of the room and placed the envelope on the table. Not to flaunt it, but to confront the weight of it. I looked at the chair my father had just vacated, still warm with the sin of arrogance and control. Then at the one my mother had fainted in, perfumed with denial and elitism. Then the one Ava had tossed to the ground, spilled entitlement and venom still clinging to it. I took a breath, and I spoke. Not loudly, not bitterly, just clearly. For the first time, not to be heard, but to be understood. You all always said I didn't belong, I began. That I wasn't cut from the same cloth. That I wasn't ambitious enough, polished enough, educated enough. But what you really meant was, I wasn't willing to play the game. The game where love was conditional, respect was transactional, and appearances mattered more than truth. You build a family around a name, and then forgot what it was supposed to stand for. I walked slowly around the table, letting the silence drink in every word. I never asked Grandpa for anything. Not once. But I showed up. When his hand shook too much to button his shirt. When he forgot what day it was. When the medicine made him sick, and none of you picked up your phones. I was there. Not because I was perfect. Not because I was planning to inherit anything. But because I loved him. I paused then. Not for effect, but because I remembered that night he cried quietly behind closed doors when the doctors told him his cancer was terminal. He'd said, "Mason, dying's not the hard part. It's dying and realizing your life only mattered to people after you were gone." I had promised him then I would always show up while he was still here. And I did. Every single time. "So don't talk to me about what I deserve," I continued, voice steadier now. "Don't talk to me about manipulation or favoritism. This wasn't about wealth. This was about presence. About action. While you were choosing which color scheme to use for your Cape Cod retreat, I was choosing which dosage to give him before bedtime. While you were planning your vacations, I was holding his hand through radiation. I didn't win. You just didn't show up. I let that hang there. The truth. It burned quietly. Not to harm, but to cleanse. "I'm not going to fight you in court," I added. "I don't need to justify anything. If you want to appeal the will, go ahead. You'll lose. But more importantly, you've already lost. Because Grandpa didn't just sign his name on a document. He made a decision about legacy. About what the Whitmore name should stand for." Carlisle had stopped sorting his papers. He was just watching me now, the way someone watches a final act unfold after sitting through a very long performance. I gave a small, half smile and finished, and as far as I'm concerned, this family can continue playing pretend, continue chasing titles and clinging to control. But the truth? The truth belongs to the one who earned it. Quietly, faithfully, fully. I picked up the envelope again and walked toward the door. The sound of my shoes now filled the entire space where once I had moved unnoticed. I stopped before exiting and looked back one last time, not with hatred, not with revenge in my eyes, but with freedom. I said one final thing. "I used to think not being like you was a curse," I said. "Now I know it was the best thing Grandpa ever gave me." Then I walked out. The morning after the will reading, I woke up to sunlight streaming across the floor of my apartment, the one I'd lived in for 5 years, with creaky floors and a leaky faucet that I never got around to fixing. It was quiet. Still. No urgent calls. No lawyers. No family drama. Just quiet. But it wasn't empty. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a storm, a calm that lets you feel, finally, that the worst is behind you. I walked into the kitchen, made a cup of coffee, and sat in the same spot I had every day except now. The world outside my window felt different. I didn't rush to touch the bank accounts or tour the properties. I didn't contact the board of Whitmore Enterprises to make any sweeping changes. That wasn't why I came this far. I had carried my grandfather's name not just in paperwork, but in service and care and presence. That meant something, and it deserved to be honored the right way. Over the next few weeks, I took meetings slowly. I met with the estate attorneys, not to flaunt what I now owned, but to understand it. I wanted to know what I was responsible for, not just what I had been handed. Some reporters tried to sniff around, hoping for drama, a family feud worthy of headlines. Ava's boyfriend leaked half a story to a local tabloid, claiming I'd manipulated Grandpa in his final days. But Carlisle had anticipated all of it. The video recordings, the notarized documents, and Grandpa's own words rendered every accusation weightless. Truth has a funny way of silencing noise. And when it was all quiet again, I started making moves, not for revenge, but for restoration. I visited the Cape Cod house, not to move in, but to turn it into a retreat for terminally ill veterans. Grandpa would have liked that. I hired counselors, set up a small fund in his name, and installed a wooden bench under the big oak tree in the backyard. On the plaque, I carved the words he once said to me. The strongest tree bends in silence. That place, once reserved for family getaways I was never invited to, now belonged to people who knew something about endurance. Back at Whitmore Enterprises, I kept a low profile at first. I didn't storm in and fire everyone. I didn't wear designer suits or demand anyone call me sir. I sat in on every meeting, listened more than I spoke, and slowly, people began to understand. I wasn't there to take over. I was there to rebuild. The company had been profitable, sure, but it had lost its soul years ago. Employees walked on eggshells. Promotions were favors. Turnover was a revolving door. So I started changing that. Quietly, intentionally. I created a new department, Whitmore Initiatives. Its purpose was simple: to invest in people who had been written off. Vocational programs, small business grants, career training for adults who had left school early. For every handshake my father once made with the elite, I shook hands with carpenters, nurses, single parents, and immigrants with dreams. These were my people. I hadn't just come from them. I was one of them. My parents tried to reach out after the dust settled. A letter first, then a voicemail. Then a message delivered through their lawyer, wrapped in legal politeness. They wanted to meet, to talk things through, to heal. But I didn't respond. Not because I hated them, but because I didn't trust them. Some betrayals don't scream, they erode. Slowly, over years. And by the time you notice, you're too hollow to fight back. I wasn't hollow anymore. But I wasn't stupid either. Some bridges don't burn. They rot. Quietly. Completely. Ava, to her credit, stayed silent. Whether out of shame or strategy, I didn't know. I heard she was trying to start her own business with what remained of her trust. I wished her no harm. Just distance. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. Not to them. Not to anyone. That's what legacy really meant. Not what you inherit, but what you build after the inheritance is cleared. 1 year later, I stood in front of the Whitmore Foundation Gala, dressed simply, no photographers, no grand entrance. Just me and a room full of people who had benefited from a man whose final act was to see through the noise of bloodlines and give love where love had lived. I told them the story of a boy who used to eat dinner alone, who spent holidays in the garage because the living room was too crowded with indifference, who found his worth not in a fortune, but in a man who loved him enough to rewrite everything. That boy was me, and that legacy was his. If you've ever been made to feel like an outsider in your own family, this story is for you. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if it moved you, even quietly. Your silence doesn't mean you're weak. Sometimes, it's just power waiting for the right moment to speak.